everyone. It is finally Friday. Thank you all for joining us this morning. And today we're talking about the emotional roller coaster that one goes through as they prepare to relocate either to another country or back home. We will also talk about in this session what happens to us, the ones who are left behind when our close friends leave. So today we are joined by Dr. Sanveen Kang. She's the founder and head psychologist at Psych. She is a good friend of ours, and she's our go-to during the height of the pandemic, where we spoke about mental health and things like that. So just admitting one more. Dr. Sanveen, hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Before we start with your slides, for the people who have not met you before, or have not seen you, can you tell a little bit something more about yourself and what you do over there at Psych?
Yes, so I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I work across the lifespan with families with children as young as 12 months of age, all the way through to adult years. We work largely with children and adolescents and families, mostly from the expatriate communities. So seeing the international moves happening is something that is quite frequent currently with the pandemic ongoing. Psych is a specialist psychologist clinic. We have varied types of mental health professionals, as well as allied health professionals, so speech therapists, occupational therapists, educational art therapists. Again, working across the lifespan, anywhere from 12 months of age all the way through to adult years. And we support individuals with a whole range of mental health needs, from behavioral to emotional to interpersonal, to more psychiatric issues like depressions and traumas.
Yes, and 2 weeks ago, we spoke about eating disorders with teens, and a few months back, we spoke about suicide and all that side. So if you want to watch that, it's all in our YouTube channel. I can send you the link for that. But for now, Dr. Sanveen, let's share your slides so we can start.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just gonna move this up. Okay, so first of all, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Today, I'm going to talk about international relocations. I'll start by introducing the concept of change, because the one thing that we do know about relocations is that we're coping with a lot of change. I'm going to talk about why is it so stressful. We'll talk about moving and the factors that impact how we adjust to the moves. We'll also talk about the impact that moving has on children, what you can do to support your children following a discussion about returning home. So not just international moves, but repartition. And lastly, we can end up with some Q&As to answer questions that perhaps you may have or may not be covered through the slides. Okay. Sorry, did you see my slides change? Okay, here it is. Now it's changed. Okay. So first of all, change is a very normal aspect of human life. In fact, it can be seen as one of the constant aspects of life, really, of being human. Simply put, we're always changing. And we're always having to cope with change, whether it's changing plans, changes within ourselves, or changes in the environment. The one thing we do know is life is anything but constant. Change can either be positive or negative. Regardless of whether it's welcome or unwelcome, change requires adaptation. So, where there's change, there is loss and grief. And change and loss, we talk about this a lot, change and loss goes hand in hand. So even if it's a welcome change, a child going off to university, and it's a very exciting move, and there's so many gains that come from it, there will be some sort of loss, a disruption to the family system, a change in the home environment, adjusting to shifts in schedules. So change often does lead to grief, and naturally, because of the losses that come with change, it can impact mental health and our well-being. There are several factors that impact how we respond to change, and these include how we perceive ourselves, And this is whether or not we have a sense of control over the events, whether the change was something that was anticipated, as well as our outlook on the world and life. Now, if one generally has a negative outlook on life, major changes may worsen these feelings. Negative thoughts and feelings can lead to greater stress. And this is made worse by the repertoire of coping mechanisms that people have. So if one has rather unhealthy coping mechanisms, this is likely to impact how we respond to change, as well as increase the tendency of negative mindsets when dealing with change. Something that affects how we respond to change as well is what we call the uncertainty bias. Now, you might have heard of this before, but this is essentially our tendency to respond by looking at things or looking at any sort of big change or major change in our life through the lens of it being rather negative. So something happens and our immediate response is, how things will go wrong, or we respond through worries around how it may impact us. And this does naturally influence our decision-making process and increases the feelings of depression, anxiety, and guilt. So even positive change can be upsetting to some. And this is often because a once comfortable way of living will soon start to look different, and people notice and recognize that they're going to be put out of their comfort zone, and the thoughts of dealing with those changes make it quite hard to cope. Human beings by nature are creatures of habit. So as much as people are spontaneous, people are open to new experiences, for the most part, we do like certain constants in our life. And a big part of that would be our support systems, the way life functions day to day. So even if it's a change that is positive and welcomed, there often are thoughts around how one would adjust to it, because we do know that there are going to be shifts in our day-to-day life. I thought I introduced the top 5 stressful events in human life. These events have been indicated or have been ranked really in terms of how much stress they cause us. And that stress in turns often does relate or correlate with increasing mental health needs. Now, the first one is the death of a loved one. Second is divorce. The third is moving. Fourth being major illness or injury, and the fifth being job loss. So, it does come as a shock to many people that moving is actually ranked higher than a major illness, or even something so destructive as losing your job, or having to cope with other changes. I mean, I imagine that there'll be many other changes that we might think will come before an international relocation. Okay, so why is international relocation so stressful? Now, the first thing is the number of people moving abroad each year is rising, and it's mostly families who are relocating. And what we're noticing in terms of trends is they're relocating now for longer periods of time. So we're having longer stints in host countries. And while this is an enriching experience, it can be very challenging psychologically. Relocation, like I said, is recognized as one of the most stressful events that a person can experience, and it can lead to severe anxiety and depression. Moving abroad implies changes in almost every aspect of your life. There is no constant apart from the people that you're moving with. Every part of your life is expected to change. And that's your family life, your social life, your professional life, and including your environment. So it means leaving behind things and having to rebuild all those connections and all those systems that you've worked so hard to establish elsewhere. In addition to the rebuilding, we also need to adjust to a whole new life and a whole new culture. And needing to rebuild our connections far away, whilst also leaving our support systems behind, can be extremely difficult. Apart from experiencing homesickness, we might also experience culture shocks, language barriers, and the feeling of homesickness can be exacerbated by language barriers as well. So it's, there are many things that do start to compound and make moves very, very hard. Language problems, depending on the host country that you go to, if you do not speak the host language, or if, English is something that's not widely used, can pose a lot of obstacles, both in social and professional integration. We know that language barriers increase stress, they reduce self-esteem, and they create a lot more social isolation than just having to adjust and rebuilding these systems again. Another factor to consider is feelings of excessive guilt when we miss out on important events at home. This can be weddings, christenings, important holidays, illnesses, funerals, anything where the entire family system gets together and one is not able to attend can result in not only homesickness, but a huge amount of guilt, almost that we're making a choice not to support or leave our families in a difficult place. And look, on top of all of this, what we're trying to do is organize a move, which in itself is a task that requires a lot of organization, a lot of planning, executive functions, and it's a tough job to do. In order to successfully adapt, what we do need is a substantial amount of psychological resource. It's being able to juggle the stresses of the move at the same time, the organization and the actual follow through of the tasks that need to be done in order to execute the move. When people first arrive in the host country, what we do know is that they often experience a honeymoon period. And this is when there's active settling in, there's euphoria around the new discoveries. But once the stage is over, we might notice increased exhaustion, a loss of confidence in ourselves, and as well as starting to have doubts about our move or the projects that we're likely to embark on. And this can lead to a high level of stress, anxiety, marked by problems with sleep, concentration, irritability, loneliness. As you start to form your new relationships, you might feel disconnected, you might feel not supported within the relationships that you're starting to establish. Reduced self-esteem, increased social isolation, depression, withdrawal, fatigue. And all of these can range from being either very mild to much more severe, and they might subside over time. And with some individuals, they might increase over time. So there really isn't a clear trajectory as to how one will respond after the move and how they will cope as they start to adjust. But there's a lot of emphasis on the psychological impacts of moves and stress, but we also need to pay attention to the physiological impacts of stress. And what we do know is that, as shown by the diagram, stress impacts many systems in our body, in fact, many very important systems in our body. So one of the things that we sometimes do see with someone who's experiencing very high levels of stress is that they start to experience mental as well as physiological illnesses, and that only adds to the stress of having to adjust to a new country. Okay, moving on to how moves impact children. Moving to a new place is a big step in anyone's life, and it's a new chapter, it's a new adventure. If an adult is feeling apprehensive about this move, just think about how children might be feeling. There are always challenges and hurdles when moving to a new location, and your children will find that they face difficulties too. Now, there is a term coined by psychologists, and it's called the Expat child syndrome. And this is used to describe the emotional stress children experience because of a move abroad. Now, it's most commonly seen in children who are aged between 10 to 15 years old. And one of the reasons why we see it more so within this age group is because in a child's life, they undergo significant emotional and physical changes. And during that age, children often utilize their social circles as a means of coping mechanisms. As your child develops into a teenager, so between tweens 12 to 13, they're more reliant on their social support than they are perhaps with their parents as they're starting to discover who they are as individuals. So when they're removed from their support systems and put into a brand new country and having to deal with all the other things that you're dealing with as well, what you're going to find is that sometimes they do have a little bit more difficulty adapting to the change. New and unfamiliar situations are intimidating and in some instances traumatic as well. There's a lot of research now talking about international relocations, or even relocations within your home country, moving homes, moving towns, as being what we call an aversive childhood experience. So it's actually a traumatic experience for a child. And this is even more so stressful for children who don't fully understand the move, or if they don't know what to expect. This feeling is unsettling, and it makes it quite hard for children to make friends, especially for children who are shy or children who have language barriers. Something little as a difficult day in school can be quite traumatic and adds to the difficulties that they have adjusting. Another factor to consider when thinking about the impact of moving on children is that parents sometimes may not be as available as they would be if the children were experiencing challenges at home. This is because you're likely to be more busier. You might also be dealing with your own adjustment processes, taking on a new home for a new job, which makes your child feel even more alone. So being separated from family and friends is something that children do not expect when it comes to moves, or do not fully understand. And sometimes international relocations can be almost seen or experienced as periods of mourning. And I've seen that with some of my clients. The children that I work with who are struggling to move, they do look like they're mourning a passing almost. They go through the same experiences and the same processes as someone who is grieving. Okay, so how does ECS or expat child syndrome manifest? So it manifests in many different ways, and it may impact some children more than others. Commonly known, you're likely to see the same psychological symptoms as you would in an adult. So there might be seclusion, loneliness, anxiety, withdrawal. In children, you're more likely to see more behavioral presentations of their mood. So you might see an increased amount of disruptive behavior, or they might seem to be less cooperative than they were before. You might also find that a majority of children do start to settle eventually when they start to understand the move and the benefits that come with the move, when they start to form friendships again, when they start to settle in their school life, they start to find a sense of routine. That being said, some children struggle to fit in and they take much longer. I've had clients who have required therapy 2 to 3 years into their move. So they've been in Singapore for a very long time. They've settled into the schools that they're in, they've formed some friendships, but they're still struggling, and they end up seeking support. Like I said, 2 to 3 years, it's a long time. One would imagine that the child would have settled by that point, but some children do struggle more. And this is often exacerbated by difficulties forming a social circle in the country, or perhaps even romanticizing or missing the lives that they have back home. Okay, so in what circumstances is expat child syndrome more likely to occur? So it's more likely to occur in older children, children who are aware of the losses. So again, between 10 to 15 is when we do see this happening. These are individuals who may have formed some strong friendships in their home countries and will be unhappy about the prospects of leaving those friends behind. The second is the amount of similarity between the host country and your home country. So if you're moving into a country that's fairly similar in terms of way of life, fairly similar in terms of language, you might find the transition to be a lot more easier. But if you're moving to a country that's very different, the transition is likely to be a lot more difficult and pose a lot more adjustment. School environment is another. So finding an environment that your child can fit into. The likelihood of a child adapting in an international school environment is much higher, because the child will be surrounded by other individuals who've had similar experiences, individuals that might come from backgrounds similar to themselves. So finding the right type of school environment is very important to help make that transition. If you're in a school environment that is very similar to your host country, your child also gets the opportunity to celebrate the same holidays, for example. So if you're in a school, if you're an American family, say transitioning from the States to Singapore, and you go to a school that celebrates Thanksgiving or a school that celebrates Halloween, being able to have the same holidays and the same celebrations. This sort of consistency can be very important for children. And last but not least, the rate and frequency of relocations. So children who are relocating more than once struggle a lot more. Children who are relocating fairly regularly. So there are some families that move, it's almost cyclic, the relocation. So they move every 2 to 3 years. They move to a new country, or they're transitioning fairly often. These children are likely to be more frustrated because they're having to rebuild those connections over and over again. And we often do see quite a fair bit of frustration, or perhaps even protection in terms of forming relationships. So as they get used to the moves, they might not open up and develop very deep friendships because they're worried about having to leave those friendships behind, deal with the disappointment, and having to reestablish themselves over and over again. Okay, so what can parents do to help? There are several things that parents can do. One is to communicate and to give your child time. It's really important to recognize that the child may need as much time as they would need in order to process and grieve their relocation. You might also notice that your child may present with some resentment towards you because you're the person that's uprooted them from their lives. And you're the reason why they have to readjust in the first place. Allowing your child to have the space to communicate these frustrations, having the space to ask questions, to understand the move, as well as time to process the information that you're sharing with them is extremely crucial. I've shared some questions that you could ask in order to elicit some sort of conversation with your children. But one of the most important things is to be ready to listen and to acknowledge any difficulties that your child may have. Providing them with a space where they don't feel judged, providing them with a space that they can communicate their challenges without having to feel like they need to protect their standpoint or have to debate how they're feeling is extremely crucial. So it's very important that we do not dismiss children, we do not dismiss their feelings, and we provide them with an avenue to have this conversation for as long as they need, really. The other is providing positive social interaction. So if your child is struggling to make new friends, whether it's within the community that you're living with, in your neighborhood, if you're living in a condo, within that community, in school, encourage them to find other opportunities to interact with people. You may consider joining activities outside of school, whether it is sports or youth group, volunteering in the community. Also partaking in some of these activities with them so that you can be a constant in their life and you can be a support system that they can rely on as they try to navigate the new environment that they're in. And lastly, it's finding a balance. It's really important for children or even adults to stay connected with friends back home. So it's not just about resetting and starting a brand new life, but recognizing that we have connections back home and we want to maintain those connections because they allow us to have a sense of stability. So setting up Skype calls with friends at home, or sending presents or letters, those can be really nice ways to help your child transition into the new life that they have abroad. Okay, so moving back home. Oftentimes you might think, what could be a lot more easier than just going home, right? After all, you grew up in that culture, you speak the language, you understand how the systems work, you're familiar with the day-to-day life. You have a ready-made support system. It cannot be easier than returning back home. Because of these assumptions that we make about returning home and about people returning back into their comfort zone, individuals who are repatriating are often receiving less and less support as opposed to people that are moving to a new country. Now, in reality, we know that about 70% of people find it difficult to return home. But that's a large number. That's most of us who might be transitioning back home, who will find it to be a difficult period. And this is because of something that we call a reverse culture shock. It's very similar to a normal culture shock, though they differ in length and intensity. Again, similar to the international relocation, upon returning home, you can expect that the initial stages of, reconnecting, going back to the familiar, environments can be euphoric and even exciting. There might be some sort of relief coming back home, being surrounded by comforts of home and family and people who are thrilled to see you. But after a while, one may start to realize that both you and your home environment has changed, and the honeymoon phase again starts to come to an end. And we find that we go through the same transitions and the same adjustment and adaptation periods as we would have when we're living abroad. You might go through the same emotions: frustration, dejection, irritability, loneliness, sadness, anxiety. Again, similar to when you were transitioning to your new life overseas. And this is because of a whole range of various factors that make what we call re-entry difficult. One is the realities of home. Home may not be what you expected it to be. While experiencing culture shock and homesickness abroad, some people idolize and romanticize the lives that they used to have at home. I had a conversation once with a young man. He would have been about 7 years old, maybe 7 to 9. And he talked a lot about how life back home was perfect. He had all these friends and he really didn't like it here in Singapore. He was struggling to make friends. And when I had talked to his parents about it, they described a very different life that he had at home. He was bullied back at home in the school that he was in. When they did go home for holidays, he wouldn't interact with these friends that he would talk about while he was here. And really the reason for that was his mind really trying to reconcile and make sense of the challenges that he was having in a new environment, while also idolizing this perfect life that he had at home. Upon returning home, the imperfections and annoyances that you had forgotten about will start to become more visible and more concerning. So the shift in how we perceive our home environment is a factor. Reverse homesickness. As you adjust to your new life abroad, you would have developed a new routine, adapted to a new way of living, also formed significant new friendships in the host country. Leaving all this behind can be especially difficult if you don't know, when you'll be returning, or if you'll ever be seeing these people again. So having to readjust, reform those connections, recognizing that there are changes in you and changes in others. The people you leave behind would have also changed. Life would be changing at the same pace in the countries that you've come for. And going back home means having to readjust to a new way of life, as well as new relationships that your loved ones may have formed, or the changes within them as well. And last but not least, what we call blindness to culture shock. And this is essentially I guess the novel experience of being a foreigner means people around you in the host country may be a little bit more kinder in terms of recognizing your disorientation. They may be a bit more helpful, quick to offer help. But when you return home, society sorts of expects you to function as a fully functioning member of society. You may not be offered the same amount of support that you would have been. You're almost expected to jump in and really just settle in and have life continuing as though nothing ever happened. And that can be quite hard because people need that additional support to settle back in, or even a recognition that they're readjusting again. So there are many factors that can affect re-entry. So one is whether or not the return back home was voluntary or involuntary. So if it's something that was not planned, it makes it harder. Whether or not we are expecting things to be difficult. So if we're not aware that transitioning back home can be hard, and that there will be adaptation again, having to deal with the changes can be quite hard. Age is a factor as well. It's much easier for older people to transition back as opposed to younger individuals. Whether or not you've had previous relocations back home. So if this is your first one, it's likely to be harder. The length of overseas stay, the longer you've been overseas, the much harder it is for you to transition back home again. Whether or not you transition back into a familiar, supportive environment, whether or not you're moving to a different place, the amount of interaction that you've had with your home culture while overseas. So if you've remained connected with your friends, or you've remained connected with what's been happening back home, again, this transition becomes a lot more easier. And the last is the similarities between the home and the host country. So again, if there are greater differences, the transition makes it's often likely to be harder, just because you're having to readapt all over again. So what are some strategies to help? One is making lots and lots and lots of preparations before you return home. This might be preparing for readaptation, preparing for a culture shock again, recognizing that friendships may have shifted. You may have formed new friendships with others who have similar experiences as you. You know, the way things used to work would have shifted. So if you can spend some time thinking about, okay, what are some changes that could have happened? How am I going to prepare? What am I going to do? What are some things that or systems that I can put into place to make this transition easier for me? That goes a long way. Talking to people who can relate with you. So perhaps having conversations with other friends who may have experienced relocations back home, or people in your community, in the expat community here, you know, who would understand the challenges that you might be experiencing with the transition. Staying international, what that means is keeping up to date with current events in your host country, joining an international organization. So for children, it might mean joining an international student organization, attending multicultural events, doing anything you can to stay connected with the world at large can be helpful. And, you know, like I said, seeking out international news, for example, simple things like that can go a long way. Getting together with other people who've lived in similar areas as you. So if you go back into a community or into a workplace with people that have traveled to the countries that you've lived in, that can be quite helpful, because it creates topics of conversations. It allows you to stay connected with the host country, and as well as the international aspects of behavior that you may have accommodated or developed or fit into your new life. Making sure that you are patient with yourself. The transition back home may take as long as the transition to adjust to the host country. Very often we don't allow ourselves as much time to transition back home. Again, there's an expectation that we should be adjusting much more quickly. And last but not least, keep in contact with friends that you have made in the host country. So if you've formed friendships here, keeping in touch with them just as you would have for the friendships back home. So that brings me to the end of my slides. And I thought we could spend some time talking about some of these things, because I'd imagine that each person has a very different experience, and there will be a lot to think about as people are transitioning back to their home country. So I'm just going to stop sharing. Okay.
Yes, I think, you know, a few people would have lots of questions, and, you know, including me. So I don't know if, you know, everyone knows that I'm actually from Denmark. So I'm half Danish, half Filipino, and I grew up in this little fishing village in Denmark where nothing moves or change. You know, the lady who works at the bakery when I was growing up there 30 years ago is actually still there. And I, you know, say hi to her every time I go home in the summertime. So it's going to be super difficult for me to be going home after, how long have I been here now? 19 years in Singapore. So Dr. Sanveen, I love the image that you had about the egg. You know, in one of your slides, you had a picture of 3 eggs. One egg had like this just stunned look. One egg had a happy look. And then one egg had just like this, I'm going crazy look. And my question is, this is generally, so I'm generalizing, in a nuclear family, does it, like, do people take on roles? Like, okay, there's one who says we're moving, and the other one is like, okay, I'm arranging the whole thing. And then, you know, some obviously, maybe the kids would be super excited to move. Is that sort of like a pattern that is?
I think so. I think so. And I think it changes as well. So you might find that the person that's super excited might over time be, burdened by the same worries. The one thing that's happening a lot with the pandemic is people are moving a lot. I know I saw lots of people leave very quickly as well, and people are still leaving. I've got a few families that I'm working with who are transitioning back home. One of the trends that I saw across the board was initially, before the move was even planned, there was a lot of romanticization. Oh, if I was back home, I could be doing this, or oh, I could have been doing that. And then the move is planned. Something happens, and they have to leave. Suddenly, there's a change in tone. The kids wanted to go back, and now they don't want to go back because they recognize that they're not going to see their friends over here. So, to answer your question, yes, sometimes we have fixed roles, but within those roles, the emotional experience can change. So the person that's initiating the move, for example, may also experience the same feeling. So they may have doubts around the move. They may feel euphoric on some days. They may feel very put together on some days. Getting everything done, organizing the movers, everything's on plan. Moment to moment, things change. Moment to moment, emotions change.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Like, I could imagine like someone who is super organized would have this Excel sheet and go like, okay, I'm, school, movers, da 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 da. But then obviously I called this talk the roller coaster because, you start at one point like a roller coaster, you have a high, obviously, and then you kind of dip really low, and it just, makes havoc with your emotions. I sent a question in the chat about teenagers because you did mention this age group, but what about teenagers when they're, when we're already dealing with like their moodiness and things like that? I mean, that must be so difficult for people who are, moving with teenagers.
Yeah. And the other thing about teenagers is, social relationships are crucial. Having a big part of being a teen is finding and understanding and gaining a sense of self. And we do that through our social relationships. So for a teenager, the loss of their social circle is literally their world crumbling down. Look, I think one of the things that we can do is recognize how hard it must be, help, be present and available. Change is constant, and that's something that we might want to share with kids and be it young or old, that this is something that's a big part of life. We're constantly changing, but also recognizing the difficulties that one would experience. I think about a family that I worked with a few years ago, and they were moving back home into, the house was getting renovated. They're going back to the same town, the same city. And my client said to me, the client was a 14-year-old girl, and she said to me, whilst it may seem that we're going back to the exact same space, everything's different. Like, they were British, I may have a British accent, but my experience is so different. She's gone to an international school here. She doesn't use the same lingo. She doesn't have the same experiences as the kids. And she's going to go back to a traditional English school. And her worry was, how am I going to adjust? We haven't had the same experiences. Simple things like how I structure my sentences is different from how somebody who's lived over there structures their sentences all along, even though we sound the same. And I thought that was very important, and a very interesting observation that she made.
Yeah, I think that is, very valid. Like, even if you, for example, if you move to a home country that speaks another language, for example, like some of my friends who are moving back to Denmark, but their kids have, grew up here, but they have their own kind of Danish lingo. And once you enter the society over there, people will be like, what? So, people won't understand you if you're using your own, lingo, which is, quite valid. One question in the chat. What's your advice for the people who are left behind like me? I think I have about 10, 15 friends who have moved, and I technically only have 3 left. So I got to go and find new ones.
Yeah. One is, I think the hardest part is a shifting social dynamic with the people that are left behind. So exactly what you just said, I have to go find new ones. That can be so stressful. You formed a network and that network's changing, and you have to reestablish that network on a regular basis. So again, I think when it comes to, like I said, change and loss comes hand in hand. So recognizing that there's change and being patient with yourself, recognizing that you need time to adapt, going through similar steps as someone is transitioning to a new country or transitioning back home. So keeping in touch with friendships that you may have formed in your home country, recognizing that these friendships can still continue even though they're on different shores. So what do you do to maintain that relationship with a person that's leaving, or the people that have left? And what can you do? What's in your control right now? And what's in your control right now is going back and forming those friendships. So whether it's joining more groups, going out there and doing new things, trying to find new people, that's in your control, right? What's also in your control is, how do I maintain those connections? And that's probably the best thing that we can do.
Yeah. And also with like, it's quite hard, isn't it, with social media, when you've moved away and you've found a bit more of a quieter life. And then you see like social media, all your expat friends are still going on like this fantastic holiday, and you're kind of going, what? It's very hard, isn't it? I mean, when you see that on social media, what would your advice? I mean, if I saw that and I moved back to my fishing village in Denmark, what would your advice to me? What would your advice would be? Like, stop looking at it, obviously.
Yes and no, right? So
Yeah.
the social media, so the recognition of, people do put up the best parts of our lives, and that's a part of your lives that you might want to continue maintaining. So again, having lived internationally, or being a person that's traveled, maybe that's a part of your life that you might want to continue. So you might build in holidays, you might build in certain things that you might not have done had you not left that fishing village in Denmark, right? So what's in my control? Which parts of my life do I want to take along with me? Which parts of my life am I quite happy to settle back into? And recognizing when you do see images or pictures or hear stories of somebody who can just fly off to, say, Bali for the weekend, and you can't do that. What those emotions are like, allowing yourself to grieve and process those feelings, the disappointment, or again, the romanticization of that life, the life that you once have and you've left behind to come back to this life. But rethinking about, okay, what is it that I can do? How can I make this a meaningful experience for me?
Okay. Edgar has put something on the chat. We are planning to move back to the UK in the summer of 2023. I have two kids, 10 and 12, and started talking about this move with them a while ago so that we can talk about it, and it doesn't come out of the blue. We're also going to visit schools together next month, as I wanted to involve them in this. My 10-year-old, however, is finding the whole thing quite upsetting and prefers not to talk about it. Is it still better to keep talking about a move and think he may, be worrying about it, or does it then slowly turn into a topic he wants to avoid at all costs?
So we won't know how he's going to respond, because that's very individual. That being said, I would suggest that we talk about the emotions that your child is experiencing. So spending some time talking to him about how, upsetting it is to think about shifts and changes, what might be upsetting about this move, how perhaps avoiding the topic means that he can forget about it for a little while, and what that might feel like. Is he able to forget about it for a little while? What is he hoping to achieve? So I would go to the emotion as opposed to not talking about it at all. I also would not avoid the topic, because I think it's important for us to let our children know that we're here. We recognize the feelings that they're experiencing. As much prep as we can have will be helpful. So, visiting schools can be quite helpful. That can also create excitement. So whilst your child is anticipating this is going to be awful, I'm moving, I don't like this, but planning for the move and seeing the new environment that they're transitioning back to. So I'm guessing you're moving back to the UK, so there might be family, they might be moving back to an environment that's familiar. So talking about that can help prepare, as well as talking about what would we want this year to be. If this is our last year in Singapore, what would our intent be for this year? Do we want to have more connections with friends? Do we want to make sure that we spend time with specific people? What would that look like, so that that change in the shift doesn't come as a shock as you head towards the summer of 2023?
The timeline, do you talk about it as early as possible and say, right, in about 3 years, we're going to move, or 2 years, we're moving, just kind of to prepare people that it's actually going to happen? Or what do you do?
I think it depends on the age of the children. So if your children are really young, I don't think giving them a timeline of 2-3 years would be helpful. Teenagers sometimes would benefit from knowing, look, this is something that we might be doing for a certain number of years. That being said, I would definitely recommend talking about things once the plans are concrete. So once you do know that, okay, we're leaving, like in this case, you're leaving in the summer of 2023. I think it's great that you brought it up with your kids, because that gives them a whole year to start thinking about the transition and move. They also get to get excited about the new school, home that they're returning to. They also get to think about how they like to spend the last couple of months. A lot of children would prefer, or at least in my experience with the kids that I've worked with, who've either had difficulties coping with the transition here or the transition back home, would prefer to be involved in conversations. They often feel like they've been plugged in or plugged out, and they just popped into places. There was one child that I worked with that couldn't eat ham sandwiches anymore, or anything that was ham related, or thinking about ham was very stressful for him. And the reason was that was what they were having the night the news was broken to them that they were moving to Singapore. The parents hadn't noticed that, but he literally would have a gag response if we talked about ham. And that was because his body remembered the emotions that he was experiencing in that moment when that news was broken, as he was having his dinner. And for him, the fact that he wasn't given enough time, he was given 3 months notice, wasn't helpful. So he felt that he was just kind of being plugged in, plugged out, thrown, and expected to make changes for a life he didn't want.
Wow, that's amazing. I've never heard of that before, like having ham issues because you moved.
Yeah,
that's insane. Well, that's also fair, right? Another question. If you have to move when the kids are between 10 and 15, is there a better than the other? We have 2 windows. This is from Dash. We have 2 windows to move when my younger one is 12 or 14, and when my older one is 16 or 18. I feel that when it is right for one, it may not be the right for the other. Is there a right or wrong here? Like the older or younger you are? I guess it depends on the kids, right?
Yeah. And it also depends on, I guess, what are you moving back to? Like, how do you minimize transitions or change? So maybe, when your kids are older, and again, we're hypothesizing because I'm just relying on my opinion at this point, which may not be the best opinion given the family system. The 16 or the 18, you've got one, that's a lot of change. Your 18-year-old goes back, moves up, and goes into their adult life, goes to college, and the 16-year-old has to then deal with an international relocation, new friendships, and perhaps the loss of a sibling, right? Because they're off living their adult life now. That being said, if that were to happen, I think we can cope. Ultimately, change is a constant. We can't stop change. It's going to happen. It's happening as we speak. It's very important for us to enable our children with skill sets, language, vocabulary, in order to understand their emotions and to know that no matter what happens, we can navigate that. I think one of the most important things is recognizing that international relocations are stressful. They are a traumatic experience. And if we can see it through that lens, we're more likely to be able to provide more supports. Some families that I work with consider having the child talk to someone, whether it's a school counselor or an external therapist leading up to the move. And it can just be a couple of sessions just to sort of prepare and to start recognizing that there's a transition and a shift happening. Or it might be conversations at home. So, you know, we're decided that we're leaving next year. These are the options. This is what we're thinking. We've identified these homes. We're going to check them out when we go home this summer. Just making them a part of that process alleviates a lot of anxiety because they know what they're going back to. And it also gives them an opportunity to feel like they have a say in the family life. So they're significant. Their opinion is important, and what they think or feel is going to be heard. And above and beyond that, they get excited about the little things that you're getting excited about as well. So if it's a new home, or if you're moving back closer to a particular family member, what would that be like? And it gives them the opportunity to have something to look forward to.
Well, I can imagine if you're 18 years old, like I moved out of my family's home when I was 18 years old, and I've met some expats here who arrived here without their 18-year-old because they're, you know, adults, obviously. And I think that conversation needs to be had if the 18-year-old wants to stay behind or wants to move, or depending on how independent they are, obviously. Is that a good thing to kind of come, you know, like suggest like, oh, you can stay here if you want to because you're 18 years old?
So look, I think autonomy is helpful. Having conversations around, I think the person whom we're talking to, like whether it's a child or an 18-year-old, they need to have a voice and their voice needs to be heard. It's when the voice is not heard and the emotions are not validated that we do see the impact of mental health. You know, funnily enough, I'm currently working with an 18-year-old whose family is going to stay in Singapore and they're going to leave and head back home. Coincidentally, the family is also shifting homes. So the room that they know will no longer be the room that they know. She would no longer have a room in the family house. She would have to have the office, and that would be her makeshift bedroom if she were to come back and visit. And she's really struggling with that. She's really struggling that, you know, little things that I know are not going to be placed the way they would be. I don't have a physical space in this household. So it's really hard to say. It's hard to say how one would respond because it really is dependent on their outlook, their coping mechanisms, as well as the belief systems that they're operating off.
Yeah, I can imagine that could be very hard.
Yeah.
That was my question. Is it possible for me to just ask a little bit more, or?
Yeah, sure. Jump in.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it was my question just to say that because my younger one, there's a 4-year gap between my two children, and you raised a very interesting point which I'd never thought about, was if we moved back when my older one was going to go straight to university, that actually my younger one would lose a sibling and she'd be going into GCSE year, which I mean, first year GCSE. So I'm guessing actually that I hadn't thought about that impact of it. And I guess the other side of it is going back at year 8 when people have been at school already for 1 year, like senior school, and you know, and then my older daughter starting again in 6th form somewhere else. We'd have only been here for 2.5 years, and I guess the last move for us from Hong Kong to here was very tough, and we all have this fear about, you know, when is the right time for that next move, you know, but yeah, I guess that you don't find that it's easier for a certain age group or anything. It's just very individual.
Yeah, we do know that it's easier for younger kids.
Yeah.
Very, really young kids, or if you're much older. I think the 18-year-old will probably find it easier to transition between the two of them if she's going to go or he's going to go off to college.
Yeah.
But transitions are hard, and look, even if it's something that you're looking forward to, it comes with a share of losses. You're going to have to adapt regardless of anything that happens. So it's a tricky one because it sounds like there's going to be shifts and change, and I guess the question then becomes, which one of these do you think would be the easiest to deal with? And that might be what you might use as a decision making factor.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, another question from Shiva. How do 30 and 40-year-old moms cope with moving? I've seen friends and family move as moms, and it's incredibly hard for them compared to people who are moving in their 20s and are able to make new friends. How can moms socialize and make friends? Ooh.
Well, it is much harder, especially if the move is happening because of, say, one partner. So I guess in this case, the dad, the trailing spouse, we hear lots about that, right? Like, so you're you're the one that has to pick up and get everyone settled and form your friendships. Again, it's very similar to what we talked about before. How do you maintain those connections? It's not just about forming new connections all the time. It is about creating a community around you. So yes, you can form those new friendships, but the friendships that you left behind, be it from your home country, if you're a frequent mover from the various countries that you've lived in, I think there are various systems as well that are set up that make it easier, I guess, to socialize and form friends. So if you're moving to a country with an international school or with international schools and your child were to attend one of these schools, then you have a little community that's formed around you. So as long as we have options of these small communities, that gives us opportunities to socialize. If you're moving to a host country that has got people from where you've come from, so if you've got, like Susan, other Danish people that live in Singapore, again, that's a community that you can rely on. And it's thinking about, how do I form connections within communities while maintain connections with the communities that I have been a part of.
Yeah, exactly. I remember when I moved to Sydney from London with my when my daughter, who was 1 year old, it was really easy because I just kind of said, "Hi, I have a child. Does anyone want to be friends with me?" And automatically moms gravitate to other moms for support, right? So it really is important that you find your people that you like and the people you have in common with, whether you find them at the beach. I met my friends at the beach in Sydney, and I met another friend here who is one of my close friends at Starbucks at Tangley Mall, for of all places. So yeah, and schools now are open, and you can go into school and chat with all the other moms. So I think that kind of thing helps. But one must actually take the initiative to get out there and say, "Hi, my name is Susan, and I'm this and this and that and that," right?
And social media is great now, right? One of the advantages of social media is I see so many groups popping up all the time, Expat Wives, or new people. There's just so many groups, and it's hard to keep track of them, but they give you an opportunity to connect with people perhaps even before you've arrived. I've seen that happen. People send an email or a message going, "Hi, I'm moving. I want to connect with a few people from da-da-da. We're going to be experiencing da-da-da." And it allows you to already start forming connections before you arrive.
Yeah, that's right. That is definitely true. And what about couples? Let's talk about couples. Like, obviously, so when you move, there's always sort of like a fight going on, right? It's like, you do this and you do that, and you're supposed to do that, and why haven't you done that, kind of thing. So how does that affect their dynamic, and how can they cope with that kind of stress in a healthy way?
As any change, this is no different from any other change that you've been experiencing. I think with couples, this is, what you've described is communicating, staying connected, planning. I don't think it's any different from any change a couple would experience, and it really affects how or it's affected by how we communicate. So you talk about how does it affect our dynamic? So if you're not communicating, or if one party is doing more than the other, or one party is feeling overwhelmed, even if one is not doing more than the other, if one is feeling overwhelmed with what they're tasked to do, being able to go back to your spouse and say, I'm struggling to do X, Y, and Z. I need you to help me out here. That can be very helpful. Recognizing that stress is a part of a move. So, you might want to be a little bit more tolerant of your spouse that doesn't manage stress very well. If you find that my partner tends to get a little bit more frustrated closer to travel time, this is a trigger point for them, then be mindful of that. So if they're snappy, they're not snapping at you, they're just snapping because this transition, or this is often a trigger for them. So learning about how your partner responds, being aware of that, being mindful of that, as well as being able to communicate with each other will be very helpful to help navigate big changes like a move.
Yeah, definitely. And if the move is sort of like a corporate move where you actually have one assistant to kind of help you with everything, I suggest you take that help, right? Because
Yes.
they can take quite a big burden off you, and you can, and one can also take initiative to say, right, I can do this, can't do that, but I can help with that one. So another question is, typically how much time does one take mentally on average to once again feel like home once one move? Do we have a timeline for that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on, again, all those factors. Whether or not they were ready for the change, whether or not they were ready for how life has changed back in there. I'm assuming feel at home once one moves. Do you mean internationally or back home?
I think when they move back home.
Yeah, it really depends. And look, I think putting a timeline makes it harder, because then we're working towards something and we're not kind towards our own experiences, and we tend to brush off those feelings, and we feel that we're not meeting those expectations, which means we're failing, and that brings a whole host of additional problems that make what is already a very difficult transition even more difficult. So rather than having a timeline, my suggestion is maybe allow yourself to have as long as a timeline as you need. There's really no finish line that you need to rush to. There could be things that you do that make things easier, and you could just judge what you can do on a day-to-day basis, rather than go, I give myself 1 month, or I give myself 2 months, and after that point, I should be adjusted. That being said, you might want to keep a lookout of whether or not a person's not adjusting well. So, is there clinical depression that's coming out of it, or is somebody becoming overtly anxious? That again is something that you might want to notice.
Yeah. And one other question is it easier to handle a move when you're sort of older, like in your, well, she didn't say it, an age, but I suppose it's easier when you're like 30s as opposed to when you're like in your 50s. Is there a difference?
It shows you it's easier when you're older. So the older you are, the easier to transition. I think part of that has to do with, as we get older, we want more and more consistency. We might look forward to moving back into a life that's familiar, slower, perhaps not so much transition. There's certainty. I'm not leaving. I'm going to be here for a good number of years, and I can work towards that life. So actually moving when you're much older has shown to be easier. Also, if you're moving when you're much older, say in your 50s, chances are you're not moving as a family, you're moving as a couple. So there's less stress around getting kids to adapt to school, or trying to find the right school, and having to manage other people's emotions. It's really just a much smaller group of people that you're having to relocate.
Yes, I've actually met a couple of those in one of our walks. A couple of ladies moved here from the US, and they have, their kids are 20, 25-year-old, and they've stayed in the US, and she's here together with her husband, and she's having a great time. Because, now she can sort of do all the things that she wanted to do things for herself and her husband. It's kind of like a honeymoon all over again. So I guess you're right. It's very easy to move when you are older. Another question, what tip do you give a mom who will be leaving Singapore for home as an empty nester who's been here for 14 years?
Recognize that this is going to be hard. Notice, I think it's very important to be aware of our feelings. It's very important to be aware of grief. So, you use the word empty nester. I'd imagine that there's a lot there in terms of coming to Singapore with a family and then having to relocate without your kids. Thinking about what would life be like. Your children leaving your home is a part and parcel of every parental journey, right? We know that we raise them up until a certain point, and then they're meant to leave home. It is hard, but it's also something that we do celebrate, and that's an example of positive change that can be challenging as well. But what what will returning home be, and what is the intention for that move, and how do you help yourself make that transition? Maybe it's about rediscovering yourself as who you are as a person, rather than mum of so and so, or a mum who's has X number of children and you're raising them in a foreign country. What would it be like to go home and rediscover that life that you left behind, and rediscover yourself in that point? So it's very similar to the example that Susan gave with that couple that's older. You know, they're focusing on the couple unit. So if in this instance, if you're focusing on yourself, you could also focus on your relationship. The thing about empty nesting is that we spend a lot of time focusing on rearing and raising children, that sometimes the attention moves away from your relationship as partners to being parents and partners. So when children leave home, that gives us the opportunity to reconnect back with our partners, and reestablish that relationship.
Yeah, that's right. One question was saying here that how do you meet people in Singapore? Actually, it's so easy. First of all, you can get Expat Living and have a look at things to do, or come to all of our events. Otherwise, there are so many associations in Singapore that you can join. There's so many clubs and things like that. So I don't think meeting people in Singapore is that hard. Actually, to be honest, meeting people in Singapore is the easiest ever in my, experience, because I've moved here twice. So please connect with me if you want to meet some people. I'll connect you to a lot of associations that you can connect with. Let's see if we have more questions. Yeah, that was the last one. The lady who is the empty nester who is moving after 14 years. I wish you all the luck. And yeah, it's very, very exciting. A new stage in life.
Hi, Susan. I was wondering if I could just comment. It's Taryn here.
Yeah, hi, go for it.
Hi, Dr. Sanveen. I just wanted to say thank you so much. Really enjoyed that talk. I just want to say that I'm a therapist and I work with people that have actually moved. And what I found is that sometimes what happens is we get so busy with our kids and their well-being, we forget about ourselves. And it's really important that we do think about ourselves. And what I found is sometimes my clients have good friends, but maybe, they're not getting the support that they need to kind of give them the tools to help themselves and then be able to be there for their children. Mm. And, I was just going to say that sometimes it's okay for us to look for help for ourselves as well, just so that we can do that, and then we can be that sort of regulated, as much as we can possibly regulate ourselves, so that we're then there for our children and sometimes even our spouse.
I agree. Yeah. I think one of the things that we talked a lot in the other talks that we've had with Susan was that it's really important for parents to look out for themselves. Mm. Your children are looking to you, supported as well. So self-care, and it can come in as many ways and forms as it can, whether it's talking to a therapist like yourself. Many people do start therapy around this time. I've got a few families that I'm working with, and really the only goal right now is us to transition them back and to talk about the move back home, actually. Not so much so an international move, but a lot of them are moving back home. But to think about, am I getting adequately supported within the network that I have? And if the answer to that is no, I think it's really important to recognize that there is help available outside. Therapy is something that is a very scary word for some people, but it really is just a couple of conversations. So it's not too scary once you do find yourself in a relationship, or, like Susan said, I think we can't discount the amount of support that people get from the communities in which they live. So organizations, groups, there's just so many avenues that one can go to.
Yeah, I just find that sometimes when I've spoken to clients, everybody's different, and not everybody has that kind of, they don't always feel that confidence of sort of going out there and thinking, okay, I'm going to reach out and I'm going to try and make friends. I have met people that have actually found it quite difficult to do that. And you know, everybody's different, and some people just find it easier than others. So you know, it's okay to find a help that suits you at that time, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tari, and thank you for sharing.
Thank
And
you.
with that, we've come to the end. Thank you so much, Dr. Sanveen. I know you're very busy, but thank you so much for taking your time this morning and sharing your thoughts with us about relocation. I'm not going anywhere. I think I might be here forever. I tried to leave several times, but it doesn't seem to be going. So if anyone wants to connect, I'm here. Please connect with me. Everyone has my email. And if you need connection in the countries that you are going to, please also, you know, stay in touch and keep connected so that maybe we can, from here, help you establish yourself in your next home country. Have a great Friday. Have a nice afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Sanveen. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.